Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we've got 3 stories that look completely unrelated at first glance. One involves neighbors who made a bad landscaping decision and tried to bully their way out of it. One is about a late-night airport pickup that slowly turned into an entitlement test. And one starts with a single headlight and ends with a multi-million-dollar corporate mistake. By the end, we're going to compare what actually worked, and you'll get a vote which story handled it best. My neighbor's poor landscaping choice became my problem. They threatened, harassed, and even called city inspectors. A few years ago, new neighbors moved into the lot next to mine. I'm a 35-year-old guy living in what most people would call semi-countryside. Not farmland, but definitely not suburbia either. Bigger plots, older homes, lots of trees. I've lived on my property for over a decade, and one of the reasons I bought it in the first place was the yard. I have 3 massive birch trees that are easily 50 years old, maybe more. They provide shade, privacy, and honestly a sense of permanence that you don't get from freshly planted landscaping. The trees sit near the boundary between my property and the neighboring lot. There's a solid wall and fence separating the 2 yards, so I can't see into theirs and they can't see into mine. The branches don't hang over their side enough to cause damage, but birch trees do what birch trees do. In the spring and early summer, they shed seeds and bits of debris. It's messy, but that's part of living around mature trees. I clean my yard, rake when needed, and accept it as the trade-off for living somewhere green instead of surrounded by concrete. The neighbors built a brand new house from the ground up. Watching the construction, it was clear they were going all in. Modern design, fresh landscaping, the works. At some point, they also redesigned their backyard, and that's when I noticed something that made me raise an eyebrow. They put in a swimming pool. And not just anywhere, they placed it almost directly beneath where my birch trees sit along the fence line. At the time, I thought it was a questionable choice, but it wasn't my business. A few weeks later, I found out it was about to become my problem. One afternoon, the neighbor's wife came over while I was working in my yard. She didn't introduce herself or make small talk. She walked straight up to the fence and said, "We need to talk about your trees." I asked what the issue was, already having a pretty good idea. She told me that their son was allergic to birch trees and that the pollen and debris were making their yard unusable. Then she gestured vaguely toward the fence and said, "You'll need to have them removed." I told her calmly that I wasn't planning on cutting down healthy decades-old trees. She immediately shifted tone and said, "Well, this really isn't optional. It's a health issue." I asked why they would build a pool right under birch trees if allergies were such a concern. She didn't answer that question. Instead, she said that since the trees were the source of the problem, it was my responsibility to fix it. The flaw in their logic was breathtaking. They saw a natural feature as a personal insult, an obstacle placed by the world solely to inconvenience them, never considering they built their dream in the shade of a 50-year-old reality. I told her no, politely but firmly. Those trees were on my property, they weren't causing structural damage, and I wasn't obligated to remove them because someone else made a poor landscaping decision. She stormed off without another word. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. From that point on, every time the trees shed, I could hear her loudly. She would stand in her yard, sweeping or cleaning, and shout profanity toward the fence. Not directly at me at first, but loud enough that there was no doubt who it was meant for. Stupid trees turned into selfish a-hole, which turned into hope you enjoy getting fined. It was like living next to someone narrating their own tantrum. Her husband came over a few times after that, trying a different approach. He was calmer, but not friendly. He said things like, "Look, we just want to resolve this like adults, and, inspectors don't like unmaintained trees near property lines." I explained again that the trees were healthy, legally planted, and had been there longer than either of us. He hinted more than once that he could call an inspection and see what happened. I told him he was welcome to try. At one point, he offered to pay for the removal of the trees. I told him that even if I wanted them gone, that wouldn't solve the issue. Removing 3 massive trees would tear up my yard, damage the soil, and completely change the character of the property. I asked if he was willing to pay not just for the removal, but for full yard renovation afterward, soil restoration, regrading, new plantings, and replacement trees elsewhere. He scoffed and said that wasn't his problem. That pretty much ended any pretense of negotiation. After that, the harassment ramped up. The wife started yelling directly at me if she saw me outside. She accused me of not caring about children, of being a terrible neighbor, of ruining their investment. I ignored her. I documented everything, dates, times, videos when possible. I never responded in kind. I just kept doing what I'd always done. Eventually, the threats stopped being vague. One day, she shouted that she was calling the city and having my hazardous trees removed. I told her, loud enough for her to hear, "Go ahead." A few weeks later, I actually got a notice that an inspector would be coming out to evaluate a complaint. The inspection took about 15 minutes. The inspector walked my property, looked at the trees, noted their age and condition, and asked if there had been any prior issues. I explained the situation calmly. He nodded, wrote a few notes, and said, "These trees are fine. They're well within regulations." Before leaving, he added, "You're not responsible for someone else building a pool under them." I never heard another word from the city. The wife, however, did not take this well. For a while, she avoided me completely. Then she shifted tactics again, loudly complaining to anyone who would listen about her nightmare neighbor. The irony was that other neighbors already knew the trees and liked them. A couple of people even mentioned that they'd chosen not to buy her house specifically because of how close the pool was to the fence and trees. The final bit of satisfaction came late last summer. I noticed they'd installed a large mesh cover over their pool along with additional leaf nets. I overheard the husband complaining to a contractor about constant cleanup and maintenance issues. Apparently, pools and birch trees don't mix. Who knew? These days, the wife mostly looks the other way when she sees me. The shouting has stopped. The threats stopped. The trees are still standing, exactly where they've always been, doing what trees do. My yard still looks like the place I fell in love with when I bought it. They chose their design. I chose not to destroy my property and to accommodate it. I sleep just fine with that. And our second story. My neighbor expected me to pick her up at 3 a.m. after her flight was delayed. I said no. Now mutual friends think I'm selfish. So last week I agreed to pick up a neighbor and friend from the airport. On paper, it sounded simple enough. She doesn't drive due to physical limitations, and my wife and I have helped her out before with errands, medical appointments, and the occasional ride when public transport wasn't realistic. I figured an airport pickup would be more of the same. In hindsight, I should have clarified every single detail before saying yes. For context, this is Vegas. The airport at night is a circus between rideshare drivers cutting across lanes, people stopping where they shouldn't, and exhausted travelers making impulsive decisions with 2 tons of steel. It's not my favorite place to be after dark. The last few times I've gone there late at night, I'd nearly been clipped by drivers who seemed to think turn signals were optional suggestions. Because of that, I told her up front that I was fine picking her up around 10 p.m., but didn't want to be driving to or from the airport much later than that. She was coming back from Philadelphia after a 2-week visit, and despite the short trip, she travels like she's relocating permanently. Every single time, it's the same story. 2 massive checked bags that flirt with the 50-pound limit, plus 3 carry-ons. She also prefers late flights because she likes staying up, so she booked one scheduled to land at 9:50 p.m. local time. Knowing her baggage situation, I also knew that meant she wouldn't actually be ready until close to 11 p.m., which I wasn't thrilled about, but agreed to anyway. I asked her to text me when the plane took off so I could track whether it was on time. Around that time, she messaged me saying the flight was delayed. No big deal at first, flights get delayed. Then she texted again saying the plane was still sitting on the ground. 2 hours went by. Finally, around 1 a.m. Philly time, she told me the flight had been canceled due to weather. She said they'd been told to rebook through an app because the customer service line at the airport was massive. I told her I was sorry that happened, but I reiterated that I didn't want to be doing airport pickups after 10 p.m. and suggested she look for an earlier flight the next day. There were several earlier options showing on the airline site. Instead, she texted back that she'd rebooked for a flight departing at 9:20 p.m. and arriving just before midnight. That's when I pushed back. I reminded her that midnight arrival meant she wouldn't be out of the baggage claim until at least 12:30 a.m., and I'd already told her I wasn't comfortable driving that late. Her response was that her bags were already checked through and she might be out quicker, hopefully around 12:30. I told her flat out that I wasn't coming to the airport at 12:30 in the morning. Of course, that flight didn't go smoothly either. It was delayed again, eventually leaving around 1 a.m. Philly time and landing in Vegas at roughly 3 a.m. local time. At that point, I told her she needed to call an Uber or a cab. I was not driving to the airport at 3 a.m., navigating exhausted drivers, construction zones, and chaos to haul 6 pieces of luggage into my car. Her response stunned me. She texted back, "I didn't bring a credit card with me." I stared at my phone for a solid minute. Who travels without a credit card, especially someone who doesn't drive and relies on other people or services to get around? I didn't argue with her. I didn't accuse her of lying. I just told her she'd need to figure something out because I wasn't coming. At that point, the tone shifted. She became short, clearly frustrated, and kept hinting that she had no other options. I suggested she ask her best friend in Philly to help her set up an Uber account or call a cab service like she'd done in the past. She stopped responding for a while, and I assumed she'd worked something out. The next morning, I got a text saying she'd eventually taken a cab home, paid cash, and was exhausted. There was an undercurrent of blame in the message, like I'd abandoned her. Later that day, I started getting comments from mutual acquaintances suggesting I'd been unreasonable for not just doing the right thing and picking her up anyway since I'd already agreed. Here's the thing. I agreed to pick her up at 9:50 p.m., not 3 a.m. I was clear about my limits. I communicated them multiple times. Her travel plans changed repeatedly, and at no point did she ask, "Hey, is this still okay?" She just kept assuming I'd adjust no matter how late it got. That's not asking for help. That's expecting compliance. The narrative shifted from "I need a favor" to "you owe me a rescue." By gossiping, she recruited a social jury to convict you of boundary setting, reframing your self-care as cruelty. There's also a bigger pattern here that I didn't want to acknowledge before. My wife and I help her a lot. Rides, errands, appointments, favors that always seem to land on us because we're nearby and willing. She's never gotten a driver's license, even before her foot surgery. And while I sympathize with her mobility issues, there's a difference between needing help and refusing to plan for contingencies. Not bringing a credit card on a cross-country trip when you rely on others for transportation isn't an accident. It's a gamble that someone else will step in. This time, I didn't, and apparently that makes me the villain. I don't feel bad about it. I feel tired. I feel like I finally enforced a boundary instead of letting my concern for someone else's convenience override my own safety and comfort. If saying no to a 3 a.m. airport run makes me an a-hole in someone's story, I can live with that. I'd rather be well-rested in my own bed than white-knuckling a steering wheel at 3 a.m. because someone else didn't plan ahead. And our last story. How I cost my company $1.8 million. All right, some context first. I work for a very large delivery company in the UK. Big enough that when they screw up, it makes the news, and then nothing really changes. You know the type. In my department alone, we have a fleet of 22 delivery vans, and part of my job requires daily, safe, and legal inspections before taking a van out on the road. On paper, we're supposed to flag anything that could make a vehicle unroadworthy or unsafe. In reality, it's a lot murkier than that. While I technically have the right to refuse a van that isn't road legal, there's an unspoken expectation to overlook anything that isn't blatantly dangerous. Warning lights, minor damage, developing faults, those are all treated as tomorrow problems. The checks exist, but they're more about documenting issues than actually stopping vans from going out. It's very much a culture of kicking the can down the road unless the can has already hit a wall and burst into flames. Around the time all this started, we got a new area manager. Let's call him Jimmy. Jimmy was one of those people who carried his background like a badge of honor. He grew up rough, talked about it constantly, and seemed determined to prove that he was always the smartest guy in the room. He didn't trust anyone, loved flexing authority, and had a habit of involving himself in situations that didn't require him at all. Up until this point, I'd flown under his radar. I did my job, didn't complain, and generally got good feedback from customers. That changed over a headlight. One morning, I noticed that the headlight on my assigned van wasn't working. I replaced the bulb, still dead. Tried another bulb, still nothing. At that point, it was clearly more than just a blown bulb, like a relay or wiring issue. I reported it to my supervisor and the department manager, fully expecting the usual response: log it, send the van out anyway, deal with it later. Instead, Jimmy overheard the conversation and decided this was his moment. He walked over and immediately started interrogating me. What checks had I done? How long had I been driving? Did I know how headlights actually worked? I answered every question calmly and accurately, which visibly annoyed him. He changed tack and started asking how I handled maintenance on my personal vehicle, all while stepping closer and closer into my space. Eventually, he decided that, despite it being the middle of a bright sunny day, I absolutely could not drive a van with a faulty headlight. Swap vans, he said sharply, as if he'd just saved the company from disaster. I was already irritated by his tone and the way he'd handled it, but that irritation quickly turned into something else. If he wanted strict adherence to the rules, I was more than happy to provide exactly that. I took the next van he assigned to me and began my inspection properly. Not delivery company properly, legally properly. Jimmy mistook a power play for a victory. He demanded you play by the official rules, not realizing the official rules were a trapdoor beneath the entire department's broken system. That van had a tire with damage to the sidewall, unroadworthy. I flagged it and handed the keys back. Jimmy scowled and sent me another van. That van had a tire with damage to the sidewall, unroadworthy. I flagged it and handed the keys back. Jimmy scowled and sent me to another van. That one failed on a number plate light, again legally unroadworthy. I flagged it too. By the time he handed me a third van, I could tell he was already regretting his enthusiasm. The third one was technically drivable, but it had multiple faults that needed defecting. By the end of that morning, 2 vans were taken off the road and a third had several logged defects. Between recovery, repairs, and downtime, the company was out roughly $1,500. Jimmy didn't say a word to me, but I could see the tension radiating off him. That was the moment I realized something important. If I simply did my job exactly as written, it would cost them a fortune. So I kept doing it. Every day I performed inspections to the letter. I didn't invent issues, I didn't exaggerate, I just stopped overlooking things. Tires, lights, suspension wear, warning indicators, cracked mirrors, worn brakes. If it wasn't road legal, it was defected. Some days I'd take 1 van off the road, other days it was 2. At least 3 times over the following months, multiple vans were pulled in a single shift. The costs added up fast. Hundreds a week turned into thousands a month. I later found out my best month cost the company just over £8,000. Head office started asking questions. Why was this department suddenly reporting so much damage? Why were vans being taken out of service at such a rate? My department manager pulled me aside at one point and said, "You've made your point. Jimmy's stressed. Can you ease off a bit?" I asked him very calmly which part of the safety inspection he wanted me to ignore. He didn't answer that question. I didn't ease off. After about 5 months of this, head office had had enough. They commissioned an independent audit of the entire fleet and department. The auditors didn't need long. The verdict was blunt. The vans were far too worn, the maintenance had been deferred for far too long, and the current approach posed a legal and safety risk. Their recommendation was to replace the entire fleet. That's how 22 brand new vans arrived a month later at roughly $75,000 each, just shy of £1.8 million. Jimmy was managed out shortly after that. Apparently, he'd been promising head office significant cost savings. It's hard to spin a $1.76 million fleet replacement as a win. My department manager wasn't thrilled either. I later learned he wanted me gone as well, but couldn't find a single legitimate reason. Every defect I'd logged was valid. Every inspection was by the book. Instead, he put me forward for an apprenticeship in another part of the company, likely hoping to move me out quietly. That apprenticeship ends with a role that pays nearly double what I was making before. I accepted without hesitation. So now I'm training for a better job. Jimmy's gone and the fleet is brand new and actually roadworthy. All because one manager decided to flex over a headlight and forgot that rules work both ways. Sometimes the most effective form of resistance isn't arguing or complaining, it's doing exactly what you're told and watching the system choke on it. When you put these 3 stories next to each other, the pattern is clear. In the first, outside authority ended harassment without sacrificing property or peace. In the second, holding a boundary prevented escalation and personal risk. In the third, full compliance exposed a broken system and forced accountability at scale. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new video every single day. Thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.